On a clear summer morning in 1750, fishermen mending their nets on Easton's beach watched a fully rigged brig swing clear of the reef, run herself gently up onto the sand with every sail still set, and not one living soul moved on her deck. For a moment, they simply stared. Ships came and went from Newport every day, and this one was expected. There was nothing strange in a brig making for shore. What stopped the fishermen's hands was the way she did it. The vessel altered her course at exactly the right moment, swinging clear of the rocks that had torn the bottoms out of lesser ships. And then she grounded herself on the beach as softly as a hand setting down a cup, undamaged, canvas filling and slackening in the wind. They waited for a voice from the deck. None came. The brig sat in the morning light, sails breathing with the breeze, and no human figure stirred upon her. Her name was the Seabird. She was a merchant brig of roughly 300 tons, owned by Isaac Steele, a merchant of Newport, and she was coming home from a trading voyage to Honduras under the command of Captain John Durham. She had been expected for hours. Only 2 hours earlier, in fact, a fishing boat had returned to port reporting that they had hailed the Seabird from a distance out on the water, and that Captain Durham himself had stood at the rail and waved back at them. Now she lay grounded on Easton's beach, and when the fishermen finally climbed aboard, they found that every man who had sailed her was gone. 8 men had crewed the Seabird. None of them were ever seen again. To understand what those fishermen found that morning, you have to understand the ship and the men who sailed her. The Seabird was a working merchant brig, the property of one of the Newport men who had built their fortunes on the Atlantic trade that ran between New England, the Caribbean, and the logwood coasts of Central America. Newport in 1750 was among the busiest ports in colonial America, a town whose wharves bristled with the masts of ships carrying rum, sugar, timber, and dyewood. It was a place where the smell of molasses hung over the distilleries, and where a man could stand on the long wharf and count a dozen flags from a dozen nations. The Seabird belonged to that world. She had sailed south to the Bay of Honduras, taken on her cargo, most likely logwood and mahogany, the dense tropical timber that Newport's craftsmen and dyers prized, and turned for home across more than 1,000 miles of open ocean. By any measure, the hard part of the voyage was behind her. Her master was John Durham, described in the surviving accounts as a seasoned and competent mariner, the kind of captain an owner like Steele would trust with a valuable ship and a valuable cargo. He was no novice running blind into unfamiliar water. He knew the approaches to Newport. He knew Brenton Reef, the dangerous shoal that guarded the harbor entrance, and he knew how to clear it. The men under him were experienced sailors who had already crossed the deep water of the Caribbean and the western Atlantic and brought their ship safely to within sight of her home port. These were not green hands. They were men who had spent months at sea together, who knew the trim of the sails and the temper of their captain, who had survived whatever weather the passage had thrown at them, and were now, finally, almost home. That is the detail that has haunted this story for nearly 300 years. The Seabird did not vanish in a storm far out at sea. She did not strike a reef in the dark or break apart in a gale. She disappeared, in a sense, while she was almost home, in fair weather, in daylight, within sight of the Rhode Island shore. Whatever happened to the 8 men aboard her happened in the last few miles of an otherwise routine voyage, in conditions that should have presented no danger to a competent crew. There was no obvious enemy, no obvious threat, nothing in the weather or the water that morning to explain the absence the fishermen were about to discover. The voyage home from Honduras would have taken weeks. The Seabird would have worked her way north and east through the Caribbean, out past the islands, and up the long Atlantic coast toward New England, riding the Gulf Stream the way generations of homebound captains had learned to do. We have no detailed log of those weeks, no day-by-day record of where she was and what she did. What we have is the end of the story, and the end is precise. On the morning the Seabird was due, she was sighted offshore, coming in toward Newport from the westward with all her sail set. The last entry recorded in the ship's log was 4 words long. It read, "Brenton Reef sighted." Brenton Reef lies only a few miles outside Newport Harbor. The notation means that whoever was keeping the log was still alive and still working when the ship was almost within the harbor mouth, close enough to see the very reef that marked home water. That entry is the last confirmed act of the crew of the Seabird recorded in their own hand. Think about what that line represents. A man bent over the logbook, pen in hand, marking a landmark that every sailor aboard would have greeted with relief. Brenton Reef meant home was minutes away. It was the kind of entry a mariner writes when the danger is behind him. Then comes the fishing boat. 2 hours before the Seabird grounded, a fishing vessel returned to Newport and reported that its crew had hailed the Seabird out on the water. They had called across to her, and Captain Durham had waved back to them from the deck. This is the last confirmed human sighting of any member of the Seabird's crew. A wave across open water, captain to fishermen, in fair weather, a few miles from home. We do not know what words passed between the boats, if any did. We know only the gesture, an arm raised in greeting, an ordinary courtesy between men who worked the same water, and that the man who made it had less than 2 hours left aboard his ship. After that wave, there is only the testimony of the men on Easton's beach who watched her come in. They saw the brig approach under full sail. They saw her alter course to avoid the reef on the northwest corner of the beach, a maneuver that suggested deliberate seamanship, a hand on the wheel, a knowledge of these waters, an intention to bring the ship in clean. And then they saw her run herself up onto the sand and stop, with her sails still drawing and no one at her helm that any of them could see. Between the wave from Captain Durham and the grounding of his empty ship, perhaps 2 hours passed. Somewhere inside those 2 hours, on calm water under a clear sky, 8 men left the world without a sound. The fishermen climbed aboard. What they found has been told and retold for nearly 3 centuries, and the core of it has never changed. The first thing that met them was a dog. It came to them across the deck, friendly and unafraid, the way a ship's dog greets returning sailors, tail working, nose lifted, looking past them perhaps for the hands it knew. A cat was found below in the cabin. These 2 animals were the only living things aboard the entire vessel. They were calm. They showed no signs of distress or starvation or panic. They behaved as though their masters had stepped away only moments before and were expected back at any second. An animal that has been alone and frightened shows it. These had not been frightened. Whatever had happened to the crew had not touched the creatures who shared the deck with them, and that, in its own quiet way, is one of the strangest facts in the whole account. Below deck, in the cabin, the breakfast table was set. The food was laid out, plates and provisions arranged for a meal, and the food had not been touched. In the galley, a fire was still burning in the stove. A kettle sat over the flame, and the coffee in it was still boiling. The heat of the fire, the steam off the water, the untouched meal on the table, all of it pointed to the same impossible conclusion. Whoever had been preparing that breakfast had been there minutes ago. They had not finished. They had not eaten. They had simply ceased to be aboard. Coffee does not boil for hours unattended. A galley fire does not hold its heat through an empty morning. The very freshness of the scene is what makes it terrible. The men had not been gone since the night before, or since some distant point on the passage. They had been gone for minutes. The kitchen was still warm with their work. In the captain's quarters, the fishermen smelled tobacco. The scent of fresh pipe smoke still hung in the close air of Durham's cabin, as though the captain had been sitting there smoking only moments before and had set the pipe down and walked out. On the desk lay a small number of gold coins, sitting in plain view, untouched. There was money on that desk, real money, the kind a fleeing man grabs first, the kind a thief comes for, and it lay there in the daylight as though it had no value at all. Nothing in the cabin had been disturbed. Nothing had been ransacked or searched or taken. The cargo in the hold was intact. The ship's navigational instruments were in their places, the very tools that had brought her 1,000 miles, the compass and the quadrant that no sailor abandons lightly, all where they belonged. The vessel herself was sound and undamaged, having sailed home and grounded without taking on a scratch. There was no blood. There was no sign of struggle, no overturned furniture, no broken doors, no evidence of violence of any kind anywhere aboard the Seabird. A ship is a small world, and violence leaves its marks on a small world. There were no marks. It was as if the men had not been driven out, but lifted out, cleanly, between one breath and the next. And then there was what was missing. The longboat, the larger of the ship's small craft, was gone from the vessel. But the skiff, the smaller boat, remained still secured on its chocks where it belonged. The 8 men of the crew were missing, every one of them, captain and sailors alike. The longboat and the 8 men were the only things absent from a ship where everything else, down to the coins on the desk and the coffee on the fire, remained exactly in place. Everything that made the Seabird a working ship was still aboard her. Only the people and the one boat large enough to carry them had gone. The investigation, such as it was in 1750, ran into a wall almost immediately, and the wall has never moved. There was no Naval Board of Inquiry in colonial Newport to take this case, no coroner's inquest of the kind a modern disaster would receive, no agency to coordinate a search across the bay. What there was a town full of mariners and a set of facts that refused to fit together. The cargo was recovered and carried into Newport. The ship was examined, and the central question, the one the people of Newport asked then, and that has been asked ever since, was simply this: if the crew left in the longboat, where did they go? And why did they never arrive? Easton's Beach is on the open shore of Newport. The men of the Seabird had sailed thousands of miles to reach this water. They were within sight of land, within a short row of safety, in fair weather. If for some reason they had launched the longboat and pulled away from the ship, they had every chance of reaching shore alive. And yet the longboat never washed up. No bodies were ever recovered. None of the 8 men was ever seen or heard from again, in Newport or anywhere else. They did not turn up in another port. They did not reappear years later with a story to tell. They went into the longboat, if they did at all, and they vanished as completely as if the sea had closed over them and forgotten they had ever existed. Several explanations have been offered over the centuries, and each one solves part of the puzzle while leaving the rest untouched. The most straightforward theory holds that the crew abandoned ship voluntarily, taking the longboat for some reason that made sense to them in the moment, and that the boat was then swamped or capsized before it reached shore, drowning all 8 men close to land. This would account for the missing longboat and the missing crew. What it does not account for is the weather. The accounts agree that the morning was fair and the sea was not threatening. A competent crew launching a longboat in calm water a few miles from a beach they could see should not have drowned to the last man without leaving a single body or a single board of wreckage on the shore. The sea gives things back. A swamped boat leaves splinters. Drowned men come ashore in time. From the Seabird, nothing came back at all. A second theory suggests some sudden terror or threat drove the men off the ship in a panic, something that made 8 experienced sailors abandon a sound vessel, an untouched breakfast, and a desk full of gold. But there is no evidence aboard the Seabird of any such threat. No fire damage beyond the contained galley stove, no flooding, no sign of pirates or of any other vessel coming alongside. The skiff was still on its chocks, which argues against a frantic, every man for himself flight, since panicking men would likely have taken any boat they could lay hands on. Panic does not leave a galley fire burning and a breakfast laid. Panic overturns things, breaks things, scatters things. The cabin of the Seabird was as orderly as a parlor. A third line of thought has pointed at the possibility that the crew rowed ashore deliberately for some ordinary reason and were lost to an extraordinary accident on the way, or that they were taken by something in the water. A rogue swell, a sudden squall that left no lasting mark on the day, even some collective sickness or madness that drove them over the side. None of these can be proven, and none can be entirely disproven, which is precisely the problem. The case offers just enough evidence to suggest a dozen explanations, and not enough to confirm a single one. The most that can honestly be said is that the crew most likely left the ship in the longboat and were lost before reaching land. Beyond that, the record falls silent. There is one more thread that has to be addressed because it has tangled this story for over a century. Over time, the account of the Seabird became shrouded in confusion and embellishment. Richly fictionalized versions of the tale were written and published in the latter half of the 19th century, one appearing in 1859 and another in 1885. A newspaper account ran in the San Francisco Examiner in May of 1885 that claimed to supply a reason the ship had arrived empty, a dramatic solution to the mystery. These later writers added invented detail, and some of them pushed the date of the event forward by as much as 100 years, mistaking the fiction of their predecessors for fact. Any version of this story that claims to know exactly what drove the men from the Seabird, or that offers a tidy, supernatural answer, is reaching beyond what the record can support. The genuinely documented facts are narrow and old, and they do not include a solution. The honest core of the story is the empty ship, the boiling coffee, the missing longboat, and the 8 men who never came home. There is a human shape to this that is easy to lose beneath the strangeness of the empty deck. 8 men sailed out of Newport, or joined the Seabird for her voyage, and 8 households waited for them to come back. Isaac Steele, the merchant who owned her, got his ship and his cargo returned to him without a scratch. But the men he had sent to sea did not return with them. John Durham, the captain who had waved to a passing fishing boat in the last hour of his life, was an experienced and trusted master, and someone in Newport had been expecting his face at the door. The records that survive from 1750 do not give us the names of the 8, do not preserve the words of a grieving wife or a waiting child, do not tell us who stood on Easton's beach and recognized a husband's ship and understood that he was not aboard her. The silence in the archive is its own kind of grief. The men were ordinary sailors. The cargo was the thing that got written down, and the people who loved them passed out of the record without a sentence to mark what they lost. We know the tonnage of the ship and the name of the man who bought her. We do not know the name of a single one of the 8 who died. What we do know is that the answer they wanted never came. No body was ever brought back to be buried. No longboat ever drifted ashore to be recognized. There was no funeral with a coffin in it, no grave to visit, no final word about how or why. The families of the 8 men of the Seabird were left with the same thing that everyone who has studied the case has been left with ever since, which is an empty ship and an empty space where an explanation should be. Grief usually has a place to put itself: a body, a stone, a date. These families had none of it. They had a brig on a beach and a question with no bottom. The Seabird herself did not vanish. After her cargo was removed and carried into Newport, the brig was hauled off the sand of Easton's beach. She was found to be practically uninjured, sound enough to sail again, and she was taken around to a Newport wharf. One version of the story holds that the next tide took her, that she was swept off the beach in a storm and lost without leaving any debris, gone as completely as her crew. But the more reliable account is plainer and stranger. The Seabird was bought by a Newport merchant named Henry Collins, who renamed her the Beach Bird, and under that name she went back to sea and made many successful voyages for years afterward. The ship that had carried 8 men home and arrived without them sailed on, profitable and unremarkable, as though nothing had ever happened aboard her. And so the only thing that survived intact was the hull. The men were gone. The longboat was gone. The breakfast went cold, and the coffee went still, and the fire in the galley stove eventually burned itself out. The dog and the cat were taken off and lived whatever lives ship's animals lived in colonial Newport. The coins were gathered from the captain's desk. The cargo was sold, and the brig was given a new name and sent back out onto the same ocean that had emptied her, where she behaved for years like any other ship. There is something almost cruel in that ordinary ordinariness, that a vessel could be the site of a thing no one could explain, and then go back to hauling timber as if the sea had played a single joke and moved on. Somewhere off Easton's beach, in the summer of 1750, in fair weather and broad daylight, within sight of the shore and within a wave's distance of a passing fishing boat, 8 men left a ship that needed nothing from them and were never seen again. The coffee was still boiling on the stove when the fishermen climbed aboard. The breakfast was still set on the table. The tobacco smoke still hung in the captain's cabin. And the only ones left to greet them were a dog and a cat who could not say where everyone had gone. If you want to hear the stories of what else the sea has taken and never returned, subscribe. There is always another ship that never came home.